So Alan, a couple things I want to touch on today for this talk is a number of different points that are germane to the Quality Parenting Initiative, and I know near and dear to your heart and a lot of the work that the Guardians do across the state. The first piece, we talk a lot about through QPI is really the team. And I think Florida's done a phenomenal job over the last couple of years of really promoting the role of caregivers, elevating them, giving them a seat at the table, a voice in the system to advocate, which has been fantastic. And I know the teaming part really means a lot to us, and obviously the Guardians are a big part of that team. So I want to give you an opportunity a little bit, maybe just talk about what you see for the Guardians in relationship to the team and just the team in general, child welfare.
Well, one of the first things the Guardian Lighting Program does is we listen to children. We listen to their voices, and we do our entire strategic planning on what kids say. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that virtually every child says is, I really want to be back with my parent. Mm-hmm. That's their dream, that's their goal. In fact, if you talk to kids that were in foster care but later were adopted and you talk to them at a later point, they will say, even though they love their parents now, they will say, I wish you worked harder with my parents and gave them an opportunity. And so what we know about children and how the Guardian Lighting Program has worked is we've historically considered the team mostly internal. Mm-hmm. We've considered it the Guardian Ad Litem volunteer is basically the expert on the child. The child advocate manager is the expert on the system and what's happening in the community, and the best interest attorney that is the expert on litigation. Recently, we've done a survey of parents' attorneys, of Guardian Ad Litems, and of case managers. And what we learn and what I think what the direction is going to be of the Guardian Lighting Program is we need to start expanding who that team is. And the most important to the team, the most important people to the team are the people most interacting with the children, and that is the caregiver. Yeah. And the caregiver needs to be brought to the table and not just be there as a bystander. They are the ones with the most information that we need to believe in. Our issue when we did the surveys from different viewpoints was as long as that caregiver doesn't have a different agenda. And so the key is ensuring that caregiver believes in the Quality Parenting Initiative, the whole goals of it. You can't have a caregiver that undermines the system by giving access to the child, and you can't have a caregiver that really wants to adopt and would prefer to undermine the parent. But those are the exceptions, and we need to figure out who's there that is not one of those exceptions and one there that is for the child and believes in the Quality Parenting Initiative, because they will be the strongest voice. They are around 24 hours a day. We've told them they get to care for the child and take care of the child. And so the Guardian Lighting needs to bring them to the table. And in fact, I see a lot of our situation is ensuring that caregiver has what they need to be able to take care of that child. So you're going to see some shifts about how we do our work, our volunteers and our staff, to ensure that caregiver has what they need.
Excellent. So really what you see moving forward is that the Guardians will be more involved in the sense of that team to sort of support caregivers and sort of executing that piece that we're looking for about them supporting kids and families.
Yes, there's going to be a huge component of ensuring the caregivers have what they need, because we can't have placements fail because the caregiver gets frustrated. Historically, you hear stories that the caregiver advocates for the child, and people are frustrated because when you advocate for a child, you generate work. So actually, some of the better caregivers are not the most liked people in the system because the system is overwhelmed. And so I think the Guardian Lighting could be a big piece to ensure those caregivers that believe in the core principles of Quality Parent Initiative are supported. And not only that, we need to bring in other experts. When I talk about the team, including the caregiver, we also need to include those team members that are experts in the issues involved with the family, substance abuse experts. And I'll tell you, the people that are experts in the areas that brought the child into care are the same people that are going to be there for solutions. Because if you're an expert, you know all the options and you know what the evidence is with regard to how their issues play out in the system. So I think we'll do better, and I think in reality, we'll get more families kept together.
Yeah, it's true. And the other part, which I love about that, is obviously, we have all known for a long time that the driver of much of what we deal with is substance abuse, mental health, co-occurring issues in our system. So I think to expand our definition of the team and bring those other professionals in, makes all the sense in the world.
And I'll tell you one other thing we need to start being conscious of. There's this natural theme that the case goes on, and when they fail, you move forward TPR, and everyone turns that direction. Yeah. We as a system never turn to reunification unless everything's done. Yeah. But they've rewritten the statute now that it's not about how many things you do on the checklist on the case plan. It's about, can the child go home safely and be safe? And how do we know that? We know that through the foster parent that's interacting with the parents, that's co-parenting, because it's not enough to take a class. They need to know how to do it. And so I think you're going to see over the next couple years an effort of going to court sooner on reunification and listening to the caregivers and the experts on this child can go home safely with these added safeguards, and they don't need to wait for the court's time. We can do it on the child's time. And that happens before the court time. It's amazing how many things happen at the 6-month mark. Yeah. I don't think God created children that only events happen that are good for the child at the 6 months mark. Yeah. They happen when they're ready for the child. And sometimes they happen after a week, once the parent realizes, you're most motivated initially in these cases from the parent's perspective, that we need to act more aggressively, not just on the back end when they fail, but when we see the proper motivation and the right behavior, if we can get them back in the home with services.
That's awesome. And so, one of the things that and historically we've done a lot of work around this, and I think this year really pushing hard on this issue, and the CBCs have been phenomenal to partner with on this, is to really focus and champion on co-parenting. And so, we've done for a long time a lot of work around icebreakers and all kinds of opportunities with early engagement, right? How do we bring foster families and birth families together early on? Because again, I think, like you said earlier, so the richness of our system is in the parenting. Yeah. And so, to reduce trauma, to hopefully facilitate reunification faster. We know the more we bring those people together, and I think the less that they sort of, live in their respective tribe, and the more they see each other as like, Bob and Jim, and more they humanize their roles, I think the quicker people come together as a team. And so we're working really hard on that and that kind of focus on co-parenting. And so what I would love to hear is your viewpoint on really the role of the guardians and the guardian office in supporting co-parenting and early engagement.
Well, as we develop this I Am for the Child Academy training component for volunteer staff and attorneys that work in our agency, we have to address the issue that we have extremely passionate people. And passion is extremely important when it comes to this business, because you have to put up with a lot of bureaucracy to take this on. But the challenge is with passion comes bias. And we have a duty to ensure that the people that are working around kids, the caregivers, the guardian ad litem program, everyone who's making decisions, understand a lot of the issues regarding poverty, substance abuse, diversity, because we all get into this business probably for some reason that happened in our life. And I know stories. Let me give you an example. We had a case back when I was running Central Florida DCF, and we had a unit that was removing children all the time. It was just one unit out of the whole place, and children were assigned randomly. And we went to that unit. Nothing had been in the paper, and we talked. And I learned from that unit that they had had a child that had been shaken and was in the hospital, and they were stopping by to visit that child a lot. The different members of the people, they really cared about this child. Not in the paper or anything. But what you saw from that unit was they didn't want that to happen to any other child. So all of a sudden, the removals went up. And I think we need to take a step back, and when we get really passionate, is think, are we making a decision based on another case or another issue in our life? And that's where the training comes in. We need to let people know that these parents do love their children. And most of the cases are neglect. They're not abuse. There are some that are abuse, and we never want these parents to have these children, but there's a statutory mechanism for that. But these parents are not evil. I mean, if you get to know them, they're nice people. They may have a substance abuse problem, and most of the ones that come into care seem to have some substance issues. A lot of it deals with stress. They may be unemployed. They may be dealing with those issues. But I've represented parents before, and when you get to know them, they're like everyone else. They do love their kids, most of them, and we owe it to the child to ensure that that relationship can be brought back together. And the guardian and most important, the caregiver are critical to develop that relationship, and then listening to the caregiver, what they say, what they see when they're with the co-parenting. Is this person ready? Do they understand it?
Yeah, and I think it's such a good point. I know you know it too, is, and everybody's really familiar with the ACE study, and really those acute childhood experiences. And so often, again, much of what we alluded to earlier about substance mental health is tied back to those experiences that these adults has as kids. And how, unfortunately, sometimes we see in our system, sort of a generational cycle to this. And I think that, the teaming and the co-parenting and all this, I think the more we come alongside these families, hopefully it gives us an opportunity to break that cycle of abuse, and that these kids can go home and it's safe and appropriate to do those things.
And a lot of these parents just aren't educated. To model the behavior, a caregiver, a foster parent, a relative caregiver, the model the behavior for them, it opens their eyes, because they don't know that that's the way it's supposed to be. And I'll never forget a District Court of Appeals opinion right here from Orlando. They did a dependency case, the Department of Children and Family, and the District Court of Appeals said this isn't dependency. This was a mom that gave their newborn baby orange juice. And they removed the child and the dependency. The District Court of Appeals opinion said, this isn't abuse or neglect, this is education. Instead of removing the child, maybe you could have said, you don't give your child orange. It was like really obvious.
Yeah, a teachable moment.
Yeah, and I think that now some it's not that easy where someone just didn't know one thing. A lot of it's a little bigger with parenting, but that's probably going to be our biggest successes. If that's the issue, because they do love their children, they do want their children back, they're motivated, that if they can see the right way, the solutions could happen easier. Yeah. And then that's what is in the best interest of the child, because we know the longer a child stays in foster care, that's not a good situation. The state cannot raise kids, they have not done well, and we have to move heaven and earth to keep families together if possible. And here's the interesting thing. If you work hard with a family, work really hard, and they can't get it, you're going to find out sooner than if you didn't work hard with them. And I know I keep going back to case law, I can't help it, I'm an attorney. There was a case in Port St. Lucie, another District Court of Appeals case. It was before the District Court of Appeals court had known we privatized, okay? So they didn't know that all the services were contracted out. And a substance abuse provider was working with a parent. And they worked harder than anyone had ever worked on it was great, it was really great, but the parent failed. And it was interesting because in the District Court of Appeals opinion, they blasted DCF for not working with the parent and just going to TPR, and then they commended the substance abuse about, we wouldn't give it, but they worked so hard to reunify that it didn't work out. What they didn't realize is that was the system now. Yeah. And so our system is geared toward, with the providers, working hard, and the foster parents working hard to keep families together. And in reality, it's good for children, because if you work hard and do the co-parenting and all this and it doesn't work out, you're going to know maybe at month 6 instead of year 2. And that's where the success is.
And the other part too, which I know you've seen and I've seen a lot of, is when that happens and the biological parent comes to a place where they recognize that this is not going to be a successful process for them, that they often develop such a relationship with the foster parent that they actually begin to advocate that that's the person that they want to keep their children, right?
It's amazing how often they surrender their rights and they ask, I will surrender my rights if they can have it. And they keep a relationship with the family.
Exactly, yeah.
And that is just an amazing phenomena. Yeah. And I'll tell you one of the most exciting things I've ever been to. Starting in 2008, and every year they were doing a reunification day in Miami. And the case managers, the caregivers, the parents, and they basically awarded these parents for being heroes to their kids. And it was more emotional than Adoption Day. It was kind of crazy. I had never been to one. I had pushed for it. And a lot of people came to the table to want to do it. And the people that came to the table were the providers, because they love when you see that. And the community-based care is a provider. The foster parents are providers, and they're there to put families back together if they can. And those are the biggest successes.
Yeah. And the other part too, Alan, which I love about the co-parenting piece, is that, for all of that stuff to work out, right? For us to successfully transition a child back to their family, that family to remain whole, for them to be successful moving forward without us, right? A lot of people do a lot of work to positively contribute to that situation. And I think particularly, our foster families obviously do a phenomenal job with that, but so often sort of quietly in the background, case managers do a ton of work to make that happen too. Same guardians, there's a lot of folks that I think, pour their life and their soul into those families. And so I think it's huge for them to sort of spike the football, right? Yeah. It's like to really celebrate when that works and we make that happen. That's a huge moment for that team, for that group of folks that came together around those kids.
And we're starting to see that more and more. We're starting to see events that celebrate reunification. Historically, we've always done the adoption events, but if you look at the adoption event, it's a huge victory, but it's in the face of defeat. Yeah. The statute and the goals of child welfare is to keep families together, and if they get separated, to bring them back together. Yeah. So, I think that you're going to see more of that. I know the American Bar Association has highlighted that, and they've started doing those reunification events around the state. They just did one recently in Brevard with Judge McKibben, very emotional. And it also reinforces that there can be success. One of the challenges I think we see is if we only celebrate those cases, if we're only celebrating when children get adopted, we're basically, and never celebrating families getting back together, it gives a different focus on the system about if we want to celebrate. Yeah. And we can start celebrating families being together. Yeah. And in reality, the biggest person celebrating is that child, because they get to be with their parent again.
Absolutely. And the other part, which I often think about, is, if you're a social worker and you're in this, right, and you're a guardian, you're in this, doing this work, you came into this work because you fundamentally believe people can be better, right? Yeah. They can do better, we can help them, we can empower them. And so I think to see all of the fruits of your labor, right, on those cases, you talk to the guardians every day, and the work and the advocacy that they do on behalf of these kids and families. And I think for them to really celebrate that, and to that being such a big part of our system, to your point that it's a relatively new concept for a lot of folks to really celebrate those reunifications. And I've got to commend a lot of the community-based care agencies that they've gotten pretty hip to that around the state, that a lot of them are really starting to put more light and energy on that, which I think is a tremendous thing, because I think oftentimes, to me, if I'm a social worker and I feel validated in that way and I feel successful, I'm probably more likely to stay in my job because I feel like I'm making a difference, right?
That's the key, making a difference. I have seen the Guardian Ad Litem program. What we have done is we've always had a legislative agenda, and it's always supposed to be about the child. But if you look at our legislative agenda, it's really about the caregiver. Yeah. We focused initially on normalcy. And by the way, the statute's not called normalcy. That's the wrong name for it. It's actually the Quality Parenting for Children in Foster Care Act, because it's not about normalcy. It's about children need parenting. And that's the interesting thing about us pushing for it for the kids, but really the caregiver needs to make a decision real time for kids. We've given these children to caregivers to make decisions 24 hours a day, yet anytime any decision of relevance came in, the decision was delayed to have a staffing. And I think that was a big commitment of the entire system to caregivers. And so we've put a lot in their hand about being able to make the day-to-day decisions as long as it's reasonable, and gave them liability protection, because that was important. And so, so much that we actually even wrote in the statute that the case managers and providers in DCF don't get to make those decisions, because the caregivers are the ones that we're going to have to believe in. They're the ones that are parenting these kids. Those are the ones that are teaching them the values until we can get the parent back in and do some co-parenting and have the case move on to a better place.
Yeah, and I think to your point about normalcy, and I think it's interesting, now that we've had it in Florida here for, a number of years, and it's sort of been implemented and embraced, and it's sort of baked in the cake of how our system works. It's sort of interesting to kind of see itself play out in our ability to continue to support caregivers and make good decisions for kids that make sense, in their normal lives. And I know the Guardians office was huge in all of that. So through to today, and sort of as we, sort of steady state our system of care, what do you think about the Guardians' role even today, sort of day to day, and what they do to continue to support and champion caregivers in making those decisions and supporting kids in sort of their normal activities?
The statute gives us authority to make standards, and those standards guide what the volunteer in the guardian ad litem team does. And in those standards, we have remedies when we believe that families, caregivers aren't being allowed to make decisions, to parent these kids. And, it's interesting because a lot of the issues come up as this is a normalcy thing, and it may be a bad placement thing. Yeah. And so I think we need to always be careful that we're supporting the caregiver as long as they act as a reasonable, prudent parent. Being a reasonable, prudent parent doesn't mean they're going to make decisions that I would make as the guardian ad litem, yeah, or that you would make. I know that there's some parents that don't want their kids to have a cell phone until they're 8 or maybe 12. As long as it's reasonable, that's going to be okay. And I think one of the things we have to do in our standards is understand that as long as it's the caregiver making the decisions and not some policy or rule, because we want those kids, because a lot of these foster families and relative caregivers have their own kids in the house too. We want the kids to be treated the same. We want them to be parenting as if they're their own kids. And so we have remedies when we believe that they're not being permitted to act as a reasonable, prudent caregiver. In fact, it's not unusual where an issue comes up and I just send them the statute and they go, oh, okay. Because they keep asking, can we do this? Can we do this? And I go, let me send you the statute. And they read it and they go, okay. And a lot of it is continuing educating. Within the next few years, it's going to be embedded. After we passed the law, they made it, Obama signed a law making it a national thing. And now we've gone further. Now we've got foster kids driving, which was unheard of years ago. And the caregivers, we believe in them, and we're not going to have them be out-of-pocket expense for this driving. So I think that's another good thing. These part of parenting, I felt one of the biggest parts was teaching my kids to drive.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, it's I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm certainly nervous about that moment when that time comes.
Well, the foster kids I taught to drive did better than my kids. My kid, the first time we got in the car, crashed into a pole. We went straight instead of reverse. First time he got in the wheel, we hit something. So I think I've done better with foster kids, teaching them to drive, than my own kids right now.
That's funny, I'm sure. And so the one other piece too that I think kind of dovetails on the co-parenting piece that we had touched on earlier is related to transitions. And really, I've heard so many different situations across the state and even across the country about when either lack of transition or really poor transition, whether it's, into the system or from foster care back to the biological parents or even foster care to adoption, and how much our inability to execute a really solid, strong transition sort of adversely impacts the kids, the families that are involved, even the biological children of the families involved. And what I'd be really interested in is what your perspective is of the role of the Guardian's office and individual guardians on the team trying to support and facilitate good transitions.
Let's put it this way. 2 or 3 years ago, we did a bill called the Child's Best Hope Act. And it dealt with children that were taken out of the system by private adoptions. And we listened to a lot of foster parents during this. I was interacting with them because we had bad situations happening and the decisions being made weren't in the best interest of the child. But a key component of that statute was to require the judge to consider how we transition and give some advice on what to consider. We're going to be putting that specifically. In the end, there's always someone that has to make a decision, and that's going to be the judge. But I think we can give more direction in what the judge should consider in making that decision on how we transition children. So I think you're going to see, in practice, we do that, we say that, but when you're in court and the judge orders a child home and then walks out of the door and it's over, I mean, that's a real challenge. So I think we need to give a little more guidance. Judges change all the time. A lot of judges come from a different division that had nothing to do with children, and they see it as basically a black and white letter law. You make decisions, reunification. And although the policies and procedures of those that are working with the children, they understand these issues, but we got to be more mindful. We can't have a case where a child on Thursday in court gets ordered home that day when there was a huge party for the sibling on the next day. Or school, they have only like a couple more days of school. I mean, we got to take into consideration the whole thing, but also the emotional ties that happen. Some of these children have been in the placement for 2-3 years, and that is their family. They may be calling someone in that home mom or dad, not because they asked them, because that's what happened. And so I think we need to be more conscious of that. I think the system is, but I think we need to advocate for it in court when changes are made.
Awesome. And the other part too, to sort of I think what we touched on earlier, which is always huge to me, is for all the work, time, effort, and energy that goes into supporting and championing reunification through co-parenting, how much a bad transition can undermine all of that work, right? To not set that biological family up for success over the long term.
Yeah, and I think that we look at, when we talk about the foster care system, we talk about permanency goals, but the things surrounding those goals and what has to happen is very critical. And I think one of the things you're going to see in the next couple of years is when decisions are made, we want to reunify, we want to terminate rights, but once that decision is made, a lot of the issues have to be driven by the attorney, because what's going to happen is going to happen in court. And we need to lay it out and advocate not just the conclusion, but all the issues surrounding the conclusion to ensure there's reduced trauma for that child.
Yeah. You'd be mindful of all that, absolutely. And the other issue that sort of goes hand in glove, and again has been kind of part and parcel of QPI from the beginning, has been information sharing. And I think both of us have alluded to a couple times about just how significant the role of parenting is in all of this, given that our caregivers really do the heavy lift in this system, and that all of us are really a byproduct of the quality of the parenting we received, right, as kids. And so often in our system, and we've made huge strides forward in this, but I think we still got some distance to go around information sharing, and really how do we every step of the way continue to inform and include foster parents and other caregivers in what's going on day-to-day sort of case-wise. And one, I just want to kind of get your feeling of what do you think about the guardian's role in relationship to that, the kind of relationship that they have with the caregivers and how they sort of work to provide information and relevant facts back to caregivers.
Well, I'll tell you, it is a challenge, especially initially when we're getting to know the caregiver. Once a few months have gone by and we have that relationship, there's no problems between the relationship and the caregiver and the guardian ad litem. In fact, I would say that's probably one of the strongest relations in the system. There's exceptions. I mean, when people that are interacting with a child disagree, it can be bad sometimes. But generally speaking, that relationship's pretty strong, and they're communicating all the time. And whether just the way it has to work is we're relying on the caregiver, and we share all the information. But the key thing is the judge has to know everything before they make a decision. Mm-hmm. And the person who knows everything up to the moment the court happens is the caregiver. Yeah. And I think judges believe that what the caregivers say, they can't make a decision without hearing from them, because oftentimes if they're doing monthly visits or all the bureaucratic rules means that everything's not going to be up to date with everyone at the same time. Even sharing information takes time. So you have a situation that the caregiver is going to be critical to be in court. The guardian ad litem has to share the information we're learning. We're normally getting more information than we're sharing. We're normally getting it from the foster parent or the relative caregiver. But if you make decisions based on incomplete information, you're going to have bad decisions being made. So everyone has to share information if we're going to get it right.
And one of the things that's huge, and I think critical to all of that, is having caregivers present at staffings, at court hearings. Obviously being notified of those things to get them there, and just how consequential it is, to your point about when they're not there to kind of speak on behalf of what they've seen, given that they see the lion's share of what actually is happening with those kids. Certainly, I think sort of handicaps the system. It's like if you don't have the richness of all that information, it's pretty tough on the judge and the rest of the system to make good decisions without the context of day to day, how is that child doing, and the observation of the caregivers. And so I just want to get your sense too from the guardian's office. The guardians regularly work with caregivers to try to help notify them to some degree of like about staffings, court hearings, to try to help get them there.
Well, there is a law that the child has to come to court unless the judge finds that they can't. And so I would think that the caregiver always has to know unless there's a jurisdiction that's not following that rule. Mm-hmm. So I always find it unusual that the caregiver wouldn't know when the child has to be in court. And that tells you something about how we have to do better, because if that happens, that's a real problem. Now, I can see sometimes when there's other court hearings, there could be a DJJ court hearing or something where that could happen, but in reality, the law, there is a presumption, there is a right of that child to be in court, and the judge has to make a specific best finding issue for the child not to go to court. I don't know how you make that decision without the caregiver. Yeah. So I think that if it doesn't happen, we need to work harder. We're normally, the guardian ad litem, checking with the child as close to the hearing as possible, because remember, our volunteer, we have close to 11,000 volunteers now, and we're on about 25,000 children. But our volunteer only has, on average, 2 children. Mm-hmm. That's their only thing. They work, they do whatever, but they got 2 children they care about. And we're trying to, before we go to court, know up to court what's happening. Mm-hmm. So I would say it's natural that we would be getting updated from the caregiver and ensuring they know when court is. And if that's not happening, we need to sit down and find out what's the problem with the system. I mean, they have to know that the whole system's geared to the judge being able to hear the caregiver at some point. They even have a right in statute to give their view. Yeah. And who better to give a view than someone that's around the child more than anybody? Mm-hmm.
Excellent. And so we're going on almost 10 years of the Quality Parenting Initiative in the state of Florida. Wow. Which is crazy, right? That it's gone quick, I feel like, in that way. And,
2007 we started?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember.
Unbelievable, right? And so I feel like that the state of Florida is leaps and bounds in 10 years. It's pretty impressive, I think, to see a lot of the improvements and how we strengthen the system. And, you've alluded to, I think, a number of different laws have been passed over the last bunch of years that have really strengthened the system for kids and families, which is fantastic. I want to get a sense from you about moving forward, next couple of years. What does that look like? What would you like to see happen in relationship to improving quality standards and supporting quality caregivers in the state of Florida, and maybe the role of the Guardian's Office in doing that?
One thing with regard to foster parents, I think we need to support them a lot more. Mm-hmm. I think the state has an obligation. It seems we treat foster parents that you have to prove that you care a lot about this child by using your own money to take care of this child. And that's how you prove you love the child. And it makes no sense. It's a state obligation. We know these people love the children, but if they're paying out of their own money for early learning and all these things, there's just something flawed in the system. It is an obligation of the state. The state has removed the child. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to find ways to support caregivers more and more. I also think we need to create a system where decisions aren't made based on court dates, but on what's happening with the child. I think reducing trauma for children coming into care and how we work with them to ensure that they are cared for. This last year, we passed 2 laws, with actually 3 laws directly impacting kids. And they all, in reality, as we advocate for kids, we're actually advocating for their caregivers. One was that they get free access to state parks. Mm-hmm. We want kids to go. Yeah. We want kids to go outside. Mm-hmm. And the caregivers, I know it's not a big deal, but one thing, it's the legislature and governor showing respect to these people. Mm-hmm. To these people that are giving up of their lives to care for kid after kid after kid and loving them as much as they can. And and it's now free, so they have something to do with the kids. They have an activity. That's great. Expanding keys to independence, so the relative caregivers can teach their kids to drive and have everything funded. I think the guardian's going to try to do some categories of guardians that's different than prior. We're working with Putnam County Sheriff's Office for their deputies to be guardians for the exclusive purpose of mentoring some of the foster kids and teaching them to drive. Excellent. And the sheriff there is just an amazing guy. So I think you're going to see more and more. The other thing is therapy dogs, facility dogs. We know the difference. We know the trauma that can be caused by a child going to court and testifying, or having to even, it's very emotional to see the parent you want to be with in court in handcuffs. And these kids get to come to court, and those dogs help reduce trauma. And so I think everything we do, although geared to the child, is actually a benefit to the caregiver. And there's going to be more of that. What we want to do next year is we have legislation that when a parent is incarcerated, that we're working with Department of Corrections to ensure that parent can get the services that are available in prison, including moving facilities to the facility that has the program. They have that ability. They will do it. I mean, the secretary for the Department of Corrections cares about the inmates. They want them to get with their kids at some point. We can even have parents move to a closer prison so they could have a visitation with some of the older kids, if that's what's in the best interest of the child. Another thing is we want parents to have success. And one of the key things is they have an obligation when they have an obstacle to bring it up. So we don't wait for the 6 months or the year, or next thing we know, we're 2 years down the road. We know what the issues are. There's transportation, there's wait list. Well, if we can get that and let the court know that there is an obstacle for this case moving forward so the family can be reunified and the parent is motivated, and letting the judge know is part of the motivation, by the way. You really don't want a parent to get used to not having the kid, and it's almost, that's not a good thing when they get used to it. That we can circle the wagons and make sure that parent gets what they need, including reimbursement for public transportation. If it's housing, work with them to get Section 8 housing. There's got to be some intervention. It can't just be there's an obstacle. Because once there's an obstacle and that parent has the duty to bring it forward, the law requires the department to make a reasonable effort to meet that need. But we need to define those things. It can't be ambiguous. We need to bring it to court and say, what's the obstacle? What's going to be the requirement? And then now everyone's motivated for the family to be doing the things to get together again. And so we're working on that too.
Beautiful, beautiful. So there's a lot there. I think a lot to continue to work on. But what I love too is to highlight today some of the successes, because I think everyone can agree big ship turns slowly, and in 10 years that's a lot of progress to make. I think in a decade, and in no small measure, the Guardian's office has been huge in that in the state of Florida. So Alan, I can't thank you enough, sir.
Appreciate what you're doing. Important initiative. I think it's the caregivers are the foundation of the entire system, and the foster parents, especially in Florida, where a lot of parents here don't have the supports from other states where they left from, is critical, and we need more of them. And I think when they know that they're going to be in the role as a parent, that's what people want when they come to the system to help children. They want to help that child grow. And so I think the more the community knows about what we're trying to do with the Quality Parenting Initiative, the more people will step forward.
Absolutely. Can't agree more. So thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.